Right. Intro. Sure, I can do that. So, there is this mechanic in the Outer Worlds that's a bit unconventional. I want to talk about it because I'm weird and I like game design. Yeah, that sounds reasonable. The Outer Worlds is a real-time FPS RPG game that has consumables that gives you buffs. They are often rather short, around 15 to 30 seconds, although there are a few that have a longer duration of around 1 to 2 minutes. Now, it feels like there should be a perk or upgrade to increase the overall duration of consumables. And there is, but it feels a bit weird. It works like this. The only way to boost your consumable is by using your inhaler, which is essentially your heal item. So it will heal you whenever used and also consumes a adreno shot in the process, which is this game's variant of a heal charge, medkit, stim pack, whatever you want to call it. It's not possible to unequip the adreno shot, so it will always be consumed whenever you use the inhaler. This means that in conjunction with any consumable you'd like to use in a way that extends its duration, you will have to either 1. Waste an adreno shot whenever you wish to use an enhanced consumable while not being hurt, or 2. Only use the consumable in situations where you also need to heal yourself. Now, it is of course true that requiring you to waste a adreno shot every time you want to use an enhanced consumable introduces some kind of unconventional game balance. While this is true, as it inherently makes the use of enhanced consumables more expensive or situationally limited if no actual or perceived waste is desired, I'm still not entirely keen on this design for a few reasons, which I'm going to lay out here. Firstly is that it just doesn't feel good from a psychological standpoint. It feels wasteful. And even if adreno shots aren't especially expensive, it is a very strange decision to impose such a feeling on the player unnecessarily. And using heal items when you don't need to is objectively going to waste them, when the alternative, which is also the conventionally used framework, is to use the heal consumable separately when you need health. And in this situation that's obviously not really the case, since the only way to get the extended duration is through using it in the combined manner. Adding to the, I'd say, somewhat inconvenient design is that if you place a consumable in the inhaler, it will always be used. And you cannot choose to do a normal heal, so to speak, without going into the inventory and manually removing the additional consumable. I understand this conceptually, in a sense, since then you won't need to reslot the extra consumable slot every time you want to use the item. However, the likelihood that you'd like to use the exact same consumable within a very short period of time is very unlikely, especially when we're speaking about the consumables with the somewhat longer duration of 1 to 2 minutes. So you will more than likely want to go into the inventory to either replace or just outright remove the consumable for the subsequent use anyways. I'm not quite sure what to think about this, honestly, so let's just go through the drawbacks and positives step by step and take it from there, I suppose. So initially I didn't like it. I thought it was silly to force the player to waste their heal just to be able to effectively use consumables. Just make the duration buff independent of how you use them. That's how most games does it. After some thought, I found a certain appeal of the idea, in a sense. Okay, so you can use all the consumables in a normal way, sure, but then you can also use them in an enhanced way, by the use of your inhaler, like some kind of medical instrument boosting the potency of whatever you consume. Similar to injecting drugs directly into the blood or taking them orally, I suppose. Okay, so that's interesting. It's sort of a cost-reward trade-off, but even then I'm not entirely keen of the implementation or really implications of the idea, for a couple of reasons. So while, yes, this is a kind of interesting, well, not really strategic, but evaluated trade-off in some sense, the psychological design implications are kind of weird. Generally, you don't want to force negative implications upon players. Some games do, yes, but for most games that aim for a at least moderately casual audience, you don't. Now, this is a bit of a tangent related to reward design, punishment, and fairness, but that's fun, so let's go down that metaphorical road of verbal deviation anyways. I'll set a chapter to skip for those inclined. Before we start here, I'll just note by the outset that everything has exceptions, as it often does when we're speaking about things that aren't empirical science. Albeit even here it often varies depending on the field. Either way, in a general sense, looking at what mechanics are most frequent in games, we can see that it's often more preferable to reward the player as opposed to punish them. Instead of penalizing players for playing seldom, you reward them for playing often. We more commonly find critical hit chances as opposed to miss chances. We obviously don't punish players for not completing optional objectives, we reward them for doing so, and so on. And again, sometimes presentation is more important than actual effect. Humans don't live in a world of quantified statistics. That would likely be more annoying than this, even though the outcome is ultimately the same from an objective standpoint. This is because of how humans perceive things psychologically. Losing things feels comparatively worse than gaining things for most people, so there is no real reason for us to impose this feeling unnecessarily. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we don't have random punishments. We construct difficulty around skill. This is because of how humans naturally perceive things psychologically. A game where you randomly fuck the player for no reason will be perceived as unfair for most people. Losing because of incompetency tends to be more acceptable since it's preventable, at least theoretically. You can get better. If it's random, well, you can't, and people don't like the perception of being unable to control outcomes, especially in regards to negative events. Getting a random reward is generally fine. It is at most perceived as unearned or arbitrary. There is of course a limit where it becomes excessively overutilized, in which case the sense of value, accomplishment and reward can start to diminish. Why even do missions if you just get random rewards all the time either way? And additionally, as we know, if there is no limiting factor to a resource, it loses its sense of value. Nevertheless, the upper limit is significantly higher here. Random punishments, meanwhile, are likely to be perceived as unfair, and the limit is reached rather quickly. If we have a boss with a 1% chance to do an attack which instantaneously kills the player, do you think people will like it? Even if the boss isn't that hard and is likely to require less attempts than a significantly more difficult boss? Well, no, because it isn't fair. It has nothing to do with skill, and you can't get better to prevent it. It's just luck. A game like Dark Souls works rather well to exemplify this. In this game, you're certainly likely to die a fair amount of times, especially the first time around, but very many players still like it, or at least find it completely acceptable. That's because it's fundamentally fair, at least predominantly. Basically everything in the game is avoidable as long as you're familiar enough with the game. You probably won't be avoiding and dodging everything the first time around, but when you're familiar enough with the game, the controls, as well as the attacks of the different enemies and bosses, mostly yeah, sure. Additionally, just in relation to what I said previously, it is worth mentioning here that Dark Souls does have random rewards. There's powerful items and weapons that drop randomly from enemies and bosses, but that's fine. You're happy if you get them, but you make do if you don't. Random rewards generally are fine. Random punishments, not so much. It just isn't something humans like, since it's perceived as unfair. And unsurprisingly, the principle of fairness tends to hold true independent of where it shows up, such as in society. An example of this is undeserved wealth. While many can be jealous of hard-working entrepreneurs who manages to get rich, there's also many who would say that if you work hard for it, maybe you deserve it, and it might even be meritorious. People born into wealth, living solely out of inheritance or luck, tends to be a bit more contentious. Now, it obviously varies, but you always have to speak in generalities when it concerns issues such as public opinions and sentiments. Even worse, though, is if you acquire your wealth through cheating, deception, fraud. That's dishonest, immoral, and indeed unfair. Not just because you've been unfairly enriched, but the cheated party has been unfairly impoverished. In this case, you ought to be punished. That's fair. And we'd want the punishment to be disproportionate and fair as well. Getting even. Fairness is really a rather core tenet in the structure of human society. Or at least it's supposed to be, and we try to make it such. But anyways, back to games. Returning to the game mechanic we started this off with, forcing the perceived waste of resources obviously isn't a random punishment. It is, however, constructed in a way that can easily be perceived as punishing, or at least negative. Since you as a general rule want to be careful with imposing negative effects on the player, it comes off as somewhat odd. The thing is, you're not using a general charge to power the device, it's a heal. Essentially a medkit. If you're hurt, it will heal you, if you're not, it doesn't. Even if using one would technically be beneficial to, for example, get a longer boost right before engaging in a fight, it still feels wasteful, and even when my supply of these healer charges is plentiful, I still feel instinctually reluctant to use them in this manner. Again, it's really just a psychological phenomenon, it has nothing to do with whether or not it's a good or bad idea in reality. But theoretically, you could have used it when you needed health as well. But obviously, you don't know when you need to heal, and if it would be in a situation where it's convenient to do so. Additionally, if you would just buffed up at the start of the fight, you might ultimately have saved yourself more resources or general trouble by going in more prepared. This kind of weird psychological perception could have been avoided by, for example, having a generic use charge, which does nothing but allow you to use your inhaler. In this case, while maintaining the functionality of having some sort of booster for your consumables, which costs more to use, you wouldn't have the perceived waste of using healing charges. Now there's a number of reasons why you might not want to do this, of course. Maybe you don't want to complicate the system with additional resources or something similar to that. It would obviously also introduce a whole new set of parameters to balance as well. I really don't know, but it would certainly be interesting to hear. Now, there is another problem I have with the current system that is based on more than just ambiguous psychological perception, and that is that the optimal way to play becomes somewhat awkward. If you want to use a consumable buff in combat, the easiest and least obstructive way to do so is with a hotkey. It's quick, easy, keeps you in the game, and is not particularly complicated. The second best option, as I see it, would be to just bring up your inventory and use it through there. It's still not particularly inconvenient or cumbersome, and you can still get quickly back to the fight. Both these methods are frequently used in games and are essentially standardized by this point. In this case though, the optimal way to use them is by opening your inventory, inserting the consumable into your inhaler, go back into the game, and then use a hotkey. It just feels like a rather roundabout and unintuitive way of doing it. Now, you're still able to just bring up the inventory and use a bunch of consumables, so it's not like it avoids this as some kind of balance issue. Not really. It's just less optimal. And I find it rather unlikely that the duration boost given by consuming it through the inhaler would be determinative in saving you if the time of the item when consumed via the inventory would be insufficient. The thing I'm most annoyed by, however, which might well be because of console limitations, honestly, is that you don't have a separate hotkey for using the inhaler in a pure manner. The consumables that are slotted into your inhaler will always be used at the next activation. This means that it's hard to prepare, or perhaps rather pre-prepare, a good booster that you want to use when you're in combat, since they will automatically be used every time you use the inhaler. And the number of circumstances where you'd like to use a normal heal rather than that cohort of various buffs you made is much more frequent. So this leads to this weird optimal play where you go out of real-time combat, load up your inhaler, go back, and then use a hotkey, which doesn't really feel intuitive. The annoying thing is that you could have just allowed me to bind consumable use to a different hotkey. It is a bit annoying, and it may very well be because of the key limitations of controllers. Nevertheless, you should always properly adapt controls for the platform you're porting to, so that would only be a partial excuse. If the game was made with this limitation in mind, however, there likely wouldn't be an ability to use the heal separately either, meaning that this would have necessitated not only adding an extra hotkey, but also a new function. In addition to this, there's also several other understandable reasons for why you wouldn't like to do this. It would have caused a version discrepancy between the PC and console versions, and this could have led to ridiculous and completely unnecessary commotion and controversy, because people like to create drama about stupid things for no reason, and so on. So yeah, fun stuff. Anyways, in conclusion, I still don't hate the concept. It is interesting, at least in theory. You're able to build this kind of buffed custom booster through your inhaler by loading in consumables into it. That's kinda cool, but the way it's implemented doesn't really feel ideal to me. But I think that's probably enough rambling about the design choice for a singular mechanic I got excessively interested in and confused about for no good reason, so I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. I'm still not convinced about this design choice, honestly. But anyways, I do hope you haven't gotten the wrong idea, because I've only spoken about one specific game mechanic. This game is great. I can already affirm that I, personally, categorically enjoy it, and emphatically recommend it to anyone with remotely similar taste in games to me. I find the writing to be really good, legitimately funny.
That's why we put Martin through 6 years of vendor school, only to make him wear this hat. Even if my contract didn't forbid it, I think it's part of me now.
And still able to deliver an interesting and gripping narrative.
That was made for the 50th anniversary of the Hope. I remember that. I just got back from school. Dad set candles on our doorstep.
The combat is an arcadey FPS RPG style of gameplay, the veins of Borderlands, and the overall inventory, leveling and dialogue system is clearly inspired by Fallout. The latter ones, that is, not Fallout 1 and 2. The people who have worked on this title has clearly been incredibly skilled and competent. And if I ever get the chance to work on such a great product myself, I'd consider myself incredibly lucky. But it's not flawless, obviously, not sure if anything is. I might do a shorter review of this game sometime in the future, if I feel I have anything even remotely substantive to elaborate on. But for now, I'll see you in a bit. Ha, get it, bit. Compute.